Okay, well, welcome. Hi, my name is Jackie Fund Guzman, and as the director of the Negotiation and Conflict Resolution Program in Creighton University's Graduate School, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Speaking Truth panel. Our first Speaking Truth panel was in 2017, and it emerged from the commitment of our program and the 2040 initiative to creating space on the Creighton campus and the Omaha community to voice and discuss difficult conversations and contemporary issues like racism and gender. So we're excited to collaborate with the Durham Museum and invite you to this timely conversation. Palma?
Okay, well, welcome. I'm Palma Strand. I'm a faculty member in the Negotiation and Conflict Resolution Program at Creighton, and also the director of our 2040 initiative, which looks at big demographic changes in the country and how that affects law and politics. And at this moment, this discussion about justice and injustice, and particularly with the conversations about systemic injustice, is more relevant than ever. We planned it in the spring. We were postponed by COVID, and we're back online. So our panelists today are going to briefly introduce themselves. The way things are going to work is the folks at the Durham are going to show the photos. Then a panelist is going to just give a few thoughts about why they selected this photo to talk about as an image of justice and injustice. I will swoop in at about 3 minutes and say thank you, just in case everybody, I'm the official timekeeper, and just so that we'll have time for the breakout group discussion for everybody who's attending. And I think that's it. Shall we go ahead and get started? All right, over to you, Abby.
All right, so hi everybody, my name is Abby. I'm the Director of Education Services here at the Durham. I do have a mask on because we are open to the public, and we're out in our gallery spaces. We tested it yesterday and everybody could hear me okay, but if you have any trouble because of the mask, just let me know. So I am standing in our Pulitzer exhibit. This is a temporary exhibit that we have visiting us from what was formerly the Newseum. So their physical building has closed, but they are still touring shows. This is the largest comprehensive collection of Pulitzer photographs in the world that has ever toured in one space. And so part of this kind of partnership is, of course, we hope that lots of you either have or can come see the exhibit. We'll just be highlighting a few photos today. The Pulitzer Prize began about 100 years ago, but the Photography Prize began in 1942. And so the first year's photo is in the exhibit. And since 1968, they've actually done 2 awards, one for breaking news and one for feature photography. So we're going in chronological order based on the photos that the panelists chose. So the year that they won the prize, typically the event happened the year before. So we are going to go ahead and head over to the first photo, and I'm going to show you. I don't believe the panelist who chose this photo has been able to hop on yet, so I'm thinking.
Actually, she's here. She's here, Abby.
Awesome.
Yeah, we're good.
Fantastic. All right, so let's head over to the first photo here. So Yvonne Sosa, who is an assistant public defender with Douglas County and on our panel today, chose this photo. This photo is titled Teenage Gunman, and it won the award in 1948. The photographer is Frank Cushing with the Boston Traveler. And what happened is Frank Cushing was waiting to photograph a crime scene when he heard a police radio go off that a teenager had shot a police officer. The photographer actually persuaded a woman to let him into her house so that he could get onto her roof and take this photo of that teenager with a hostage. And so I'll turn it over to Yvonne.
Oh.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted now. I apologize. My name is Yvonne Sosa. I am a Douglas County Assistant Public Defender at this time. I am transitioning into the Federal Public Defender's Office and begin there on the 14th. I chose this picture because this photograph, because when I first saw it, I could see different angles of justice and injustice. The first one that stood out to me is the young boy who's holding the firearm. And I automatically thought, what put him in that position? Why is he so willing to yield power in this way? Where is he not being guided? I mean, at the very least, I think the majority of people could agree that he's at the very least missing a very crucial part of guidance in his life. I could even argue that he's probably missing other things like housing and food and other necessities that would drive him to think that this was the best choice that he had. And then I see the other young boy that he is holding hostage, and I notice that he's not even paying attention to him, that he's completely turned the other way. So his attention isn't drawn to the trauma that he's causing this other young boy. His attention is drawn to what he thinks he needs to do next. But I can see, injustice from the position of the hostage, because that is traumatic, and that is something that he will have to internally process. And we don't know as a community what he will look like as he's processing that trauma. And so from the other aspect, from the justice aspect, I see the police officer approaching the young boy holding the gun, and I see justice is coming toward him in that regard, justice for the young hostage. And I have hope that once the young man with the firearm is taken into custody, he is afforded the things that he may have been missing. And so that was my interpretation of this photograph in the means of justice and injustice.
Thank you. Over to Abby again.
So we got a couple comments in the chat. We certainly recognize it would be nice to be able to see the photo the whole time the panelist is talking. We do physically have to move throughout the exhibit, so that's why we turned our video off, so you didn't have to see us wheeling around. But we will, as the panelists get started talking about this next photo, we'll stay a little bit longer before we move to the next one so that you can see it. So next up, we have this photo chosen by Barry Thomas. Barry is the Director of Equity and Diversity for Omaha Public Schools. And this photo is titled "The Soiling of Old Glory." It won the 1977 award for Spot News, or that breaking news category. The photographer was Stanley Foreman with the Boston Herald American. And what's interesting is that Foreman had actually won a Pulitzer Prize for a photo the year before, but when he took this photo, he didn't know that yet. And so he had 2 Pulitzer Prize winning photographs before they were even announced. This particular photo was taken during events of protest and violence in response to a court battle that was implementing busing in Boston in order to integrate schools. And so I will turn it over to Barry to talk about this photo.
Oh, thank you very much, Abby, and thank you to Durham and my colleagues over at Creighton for putting this event together. I'm appreciative of the opportunity to be a panelist and specifically to talk about this particular issue or this image. So I kind of want to just kind of jump in with the idea, the framing of how I'm looking at this image is through a lens of critical race theory, right? And through critical race theory, we examine policy changes, specifically civil rights policies, by not just the social ramifications of change, which is what we typically think about when we think about civil rights, but we also look at them through the economic changes that manifest through these policy changes, right? And so 2 things, socially changed and economically changed. And additionally, with critical race theory, there's also an analysis of ownership of privilege, right? And specifically, who owns privilege being tied to, in our society, people who Ta-Nehisi Coates characterizes as those that believe they are white. Okay, so just thinking about how we frame critical race theory around policy and specifically civil rights policies, changing society, but also changing economics, thinking about those things as you examine this picture, we have to have an understanding, like economics in the Western world, and especially here in the United States, is tied to property ownership and to choice, right? And the social change of desegregating of schools, which is what's being protested in this particular image, means that people were being forced to share something that they believe was their privilege to own. And an ownership of not just an education per se, right? Because education is tied to a lot of things, but ownership also of like life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, but also those things unbothered by Blackness, right? Isolating those things from Blackness and the racial experiences of Black people in this country. Further, they were being forced, the people that were protesting were being forced to share something with those who they didn't believe were members of a shared identity. So, right, so you could be an African American, but being Black was perceived as being like culturally foreign in Americana. And so all of those things being put into context with this particular image, but I couldn't help when we were being prompted to look into this image. It was in the spring, right? And the tenets of the racism that were in that image, they were echoing during the spring. They were reverberating during the spring, and so much of the protest we saw earlier in the spring, when people charged state capitals armed with heavy artillery and decrying mask mandates and the closing of bars as like this infringement of their freedom, right?
Thanks,
And so
Barry.
that ties into that topic. And just closing it up, thanks Palma for my time. Just closing it up here with the fact that those individuals, oblivious to the constant sacrifices that refugees or Blacks or migrants and transgender bodies have to make because of the freedoms that are sacrificed by them throughout the day. And so I connected that image to what was happening in spring during the time in which we were asked to look into these documents. So thank you again for the opportunity to share.
Thank you. Back to Abby.
All right, thank you, Barry. So our next photo, Sean chose this photo, and Sean is actually a photographer himself and a nonprofit attorney. This photo is titled Life in Chicago. This one won the 1982 prize for feature photography. So John White with the Chicago Sun-Times actually won the Pulitzer for a portfolio of photos. This is the one displayed in this particular exhibit, but he won for a large portfolio of photos that captured what he called uplifting scenes of everyday life. Other photos that won in this portfolio included a baptism in Lake Michigan, a photo of a prison chaplain speaking with inmates, and this particular photo is taken at what the exhibit describes as a, quote, notorious housing project in Chicago that's known for gang activity. So we will turn it over to Sean to speak about why he chose this photo.
Good afternoon, everyone. I selected this photograph because the image reflects so many different meanings and layers of humanity. As a photographer, one of the first elements that attracted me to the photograph was the composition. Instead of an eye-level shot, the angle comes across as if the photographer is lying on the floor as the two boys run towards him. Although the photographer is not part of the picture, he immersed himself in the day-to-day interaction with his subjects rather than being a bystander. This adds an additional layer of intimacy and authenticity. In addition, the black and white photo brings in a timeless connection with the viewer. The size of the boys in relation to the building structure is quite striking, as it juxtaposes what is really larger than life: the size of a housing structure, or the abundance of zeal and joy emanating from the kids. The photographer captures a snapshot of what everyday life looks like through the eyes of these young individuals. The viewer is presented with an image that shows humanity at its basic level. The photograph also explores the meaning of what a house in a community looks like to the viewer. For some, a house in a community is a suburbia showing one-family homes and picket fences. Others may view housing as a condo or an apartment situated in the heart of a city. The picture here shows a housing project that may initiate preconceived notions, but the beauty of this photo is that the image draws the viewer into the subjects, regardless of the viewer's experience. He is able to do this because he draws on reflecting basic themes of youth, joy, happiness, and freedom. The final thing I would like to mention is the idea of the photographer taking a picture as a participant rather than an observer. Some of the photographs we see accentuate sensationalism and push forth certain stereotypes that are presented by photographers who do not know the subjects or the environment on a more intimate level. As a result, certain visual narratives are thrust upon the viewer. The photographer here shows a certain sensitivity, knowledge, and responsibility of the place and people he portrays in his image. Thank you.
Thank you. Abby? We're gonna have to move.
All right, so our next photo is the photo that Jackie chose. So Jackie is a professor of law and conflict studies. She helped organize this panel. And this photo is titled Freedom Uprising. This photo won the 1990 Feature Photography Award. The photographer was somebody named David Turnley, and he was actually with the Detroit Free Press. The same year, the photograph was taken in 1989. The same year, he also photographed the massacre in Tiananmen Square. And this photo of young German citizens hacking away at the Berlin Wall was taken just a few months later. Jackie, you want to tell us why you chose this photo?
Yeah, thank you. So I chose this photo of young Germans hacking away at the Berlin Wall with hammers and chisels because it spoke to me at mainly two levels. First, it reminded me of how dismantling structural injustices start in the streets and not necessarily within existing structures like the legal and educational systems, which we tend to think of when we talk about change. These systems are actually designed to maintain the status quo. And as Audre Lorde taught us, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So what do I mean by the street? I see the street as a metaphor for public spaces as defined by Habermas. And I mean the social spaces where people come together to freely discuss social problems that impact them with the intent of influencing political action and disrupting the normalized oppressive stories that circulate in our communities. Now, this coming together can happen through art, music, social movements, or even hacking away at a wall. These activities by themselves will not cause change, but they have the capacity to unveil unjust practices so that they can be seen, we can name them, and then dismantle them. You cannot change or dismantle an oppressive structure until it is seen and named. And as Harriet Tubman said, I would have freed more slaves had they known they were slaved. So that seeing and naming is important to me. Second, taking on structural injustice can be overwhelming. Any of you who has attempted to change a racist or misogynist policy that has been normalized in your institution knows that it literally feels like you're hacking away at a wall with no end in sight in the midst of a war zone. So white supremacy, racism, misogyny, colonialism, and all those isms are embedded within institutions through our policies, our attitudes, and our behaviors. If we want to really tear them down and replace them, we need to collaborate, build relationships, and not work in isolation. In this photo, you can see the determination of this young man exercising their agency to jointly take down a wall that for them symbolizes isolation, oppression, and injustice. What seemed like an insignificant and unsurmountable task triggered a domino effect in Europe at the time, and other European countries actually began to uprise and dismantle their own walls of oppression. Similar to the Black Lives Matters movement that we're all currently seeing and experiencing and witnessing today. So for me, this photo symbolizes the struggle, but also the hope of what can happen when we all come together in solidarity to dismantle oppression. It reminds me to never give up the struggle and the power that seamless, unimportant, insignificant, simple actions like hacking at a wall can actually have. Thank you.
Thank you. Perfect.
All right, thank you, Jackie. The next photo, Palma, is actually yours. So Palma Strand, also a professor of law with the Negotiation and Conflict Resolution Program as well. And she's also the director of the 2040 Initiative. Palma chose this photo, which Don Bartletti of the Los Angeles Times took. He called this photo Journey of Hope. And again, this was a feature winner. So this was the 2003 feature winner. So Bartletti was photographing the migration of Central American children who were searching for parents who had immigrated to the United States. And to do this, he was actually really trying to put himself in the shoes of the people who had been traveling this way. And so in an effort to retrace the route of a Honduran teenager who had later gone on to find his mother in North Carolina, the photographer was actually riding on the top of a freight train through the Mexican jungle when he took this photo. And as he was doing that, this local boy and girl you see pictured riding on horseback broke through the trees and they raced alongside the tracks. And Bartletti has said that he felt this photo captures their reaction of seeing him as a stowaway on the train. So really interesting story with this one. Palma?
Great, thank you. So going through the Pulitzer photos at the Durham was it's really an amazing journey, and it struck me as I viewed them, kind of with the frame of selecting a photo for this discussion, how many of them are photos that spotlight injustice. And I think spotting injustice, naming injustices, as Jackie said, is really important work. And I think highlighting justice and imagining justice and working toward justice is also essential. And I'm reminded of Langston Hughes' famous poem that begins, "I dream a world." And I dream a world to me is a great frame for thinking about justice. And this photo I picked because it kind of calls me to a world to dream. And the children in this photo, we know from the narrative that Abby just shared with us, it captures a moment of joy, a moment of promise amidst poverty and amidst danger. It was taken in Mexico, but it resonates closer to home. And it may be a truism to say that children are our future, but it's also true. It's also true. Children are our future. And in Nebraska today, I looked up some statistics. So while 11.2% of adults and only 7.6% of seniors live in poverty, 14.8% of our children, that's statewide, live in poverty. At the same time, 1 in 3 of every child in Nebraska, this is the whole state, under 5 in the state, is a child of color, non-white or Latino. And 10% of white children live in poor families in Nebraska. This is Nebraska, statewide, 10% of white children, 18% of Asian children, 30% of Hispanic children, 42% of Black children, and 44% of American Indian children. So when I dream a world of justice for Nebraska's children, I dream a world in which we invest in the state's kids, all of the state's kids. So we invest in prenatal and maternal care, we invest in preschool, we invest in K-12 education, we invest in healthcare, We invest in safe and affordable housing. We make sure that kids are connected to networks of opportunity. We invest in mental health and drug treatment. We invest in higher ed. We let teenagers know that we value their voices, and eventually we value their votes. So these are policy decisions and they're policy changes, but policies reflect community values and policies reflect our values. So when my kids were in elementary school, I remember having a conversation with the principal of my daughter's school. He was white, I'm white. Most of the kids at the school were kids of color, and many of them were receiving free and reduced lunch. And he made an offhand reference to me, sort of those kids, and those kids being, it was clear from the context, not white and not middle class. These were kids at his school. He was the principal. And that those kids, to me, that's the root of injustice. And the photo I picked, it calls me to dream of an our kids world. Thank you. Back to you, Abby.
All right, thank you, Palma. So the final photo and final panelist before we go on to the next part of our program. So Chris Witt is with us. He is the Vice Provost for Institutional Diversity and Inclusion at Creighton University. And he chose the most recent photo of any of the panelists. The exhibit does go to the most recent Pulitzer Prize. But this photo won the 2006 Breaking News Photography Award. And it's titled simply Hurricane Katrina. This particular photo was taken by a photographer named Smiley Poole. That is his real name, according to his website. And he was with the Dallas Morning News photo staff. So the Dallas Morning News sent 8 photographers to cover the storm and its aftermath. And Poole himself spent 17 days photographing the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. And he actually did that from a helicopter over the course of those couple of weeks. So Chris, over to you about this photo.
Thank you. I walked around all the different photos way before the pandemic, and we were choosing what we were going to look at, and a number of photos stood out, but this one really hit me. And this one hit me on a number of levels. It hit me as a political scientist. It hit me as somebody who does diversity and inclusion work. It hit me as somebody who has family from New Orleans who had to run from New Orleans. And I was in New Orleans not too long after Katrina trying to help pick up pieces of just, you know, family members' homes and everything else. So it really hit me in a lot of different ways. But when we think about justice and injustice, this is a clear illustration. It's a picture of systemic racism in the United States of America. It's a picture of the wealth gap at work. We've lived through so much in the 15 years since Katrina hit that I think sometimes we forget about that moment. We forget about that. That was one of those moments that was supposed to spur deep conversations and considerations of systemic racism, the racial wealth gap. How can we be better? Let's be better as a country, all of those things. And we saw on the front end a very slow response, a very indifferent response. And we saw on the back end that people started to get tired of it. They started to kind of put patches on the situation. Let's get this family here. Let's do this. Let's do that. But when we really look for any cause for change, for anybody to really look at the generation upon generations of inequities that we saw, the systemic racism, the roots of our country being in white supremacy, we obviously did not take the opportunity in 2005 to move forward, because we're still dealing with this right now. And we're really dealing with, you know, all of these things that we can't say we didn't know. We can't say we didn't know these things. And when we look at the situation in New Orleans, and we look at some of the situations that we have right now, there's a certain level of invisibility because we don't like to own up to it, but there's a hierarchy of human value that's on full display in the United States today. And it was on full display back in 2005. That we really looked at Katrina and the people who were hit by it, particularly the poorer Black people in New Orleans. We looked at them as something other than American. As some of you may recall, people started talking about them as refugees. Barbara Bush was in the Astrodome in Houston talking about, oh, some people who are here probably have a better go of it than when they were at home in New Orleans. I mean, that really is purely American anti-Blackness on full display. And that's something that we really have to reckon with right now. We're still dealing with that right now. And when America really shows some of the depths of white supremacy, some of the depths of racism in the United States, when we're put under great stress. So we're put under great stress of COVID-19, and we're seeing, you know, how people are responding. We saw in the middle of the summer, there was a great response to the various protests, but now people are like, we're getting a little bit tired of that. You see the poll numbers change. You saw the same thing with Katrina. At first, you had the slow response, but once people responded, they jumped in, and then it kind of dissipated. So please just one last thing, please let this moment not just be a moment. Let in 15 years from now, if there's pictures of what's going on right now, let that be, oh, that was a turning point. It wasn't just a moment in time. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Jackie?
Yes, okay, well, great. Thanks to everyone for such a rich discussion and very excellent insights. What we're going to do now is we're going to separate you into groups and breakout groups for approximately 10 minutes. And the question that we want you to think about and engage with your colleagues during the breakout is, why and how is systemic justice normalized? So again, why and how is systemic justice normalized? That is, how does systemic injustice become invisible? How do we become accustomed to it? What causes us to not resist it? Why are we not seeing it? Why don't we resist it? That's the questions that we would like for you to explore during the breakout. And I think, Abby, back to you. You're going to magically make this breakout rooms happen.
And the question,
and then we're going to come back.
And the question is in the chat.
Okay, so the question is in the chat, and then we're going to come back to discuss then what we can do about it.
So we'll go ahead and assign the breakout rooms. You may or may not have one of the panelists in your breakout room, and that's fine. And then we'll automatically bring everybody back.
All right, well, I think I'm up next. So the question came up in my small breakout room, like, what do we do? Like, what can I do? And funny thing, that is the question that we asked all of our panelists to reflect on for their second round. So I think we didn't talk about this in advance, but I'd say I'm going to suggest that we just go in the same order that we did our initial comments, and we have 2 minutes. I'm going to be once again the grim reaper of time. And Yvonne, can we start with you? What can we do? This is the question that we asked all of our panelists to respond to. Yvonne.
I would suggest listening, active listening. I would not suggest putting those friends that may have experienced racism or racism and injustice on the spot, and just expecting them to educate you or be open and vulnerable enough to share those things, because oftentimes they are traumatic. But I would suggest, and this is something we talked about in our small group, establishing trust and a trustworthy relationship with people that you want to learn from, right? And so hopefully it's a mutual relationship, and if you have that, and you get to that level of trust, listen in a way that encourages trust and openness. I can tell you from my perspective, I'm a Mexican American South Omaha girl, and it took friends of mine that never asked me about my experiences speaking up and speaking to my perspective many times before I decided I can speak on my own. I can advocate for myself. And so that's how it's played out in my life. I've had many friends who have advocated for me, and that encouraged me to advocate for myself and speak up about my own racial injustices and how I would like to see that change in the future. So that would be my suggestion, is to listen open-heartedly.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yep.
Come on, Barry, you're up next.
Yeah, I guess with a quick 2 minutes here, the one thing I would say is just to explore what you're comfortable with, and try to ask yourself why, right? And so I raise that because people have got upset about the mailboxes a couple weeks ago, right? The post office was starting to pull up all these mailboxes, and this voter suppression effort that was taking place. But prior to that, you had gerrymandering that was taking place. That was also voter suppression. You have voter ID laws that were taking place throughout the states that were also suppression, right? You had, prior to that, you had mass incarceration that was stripping millions of individuals from their right to vote based off of felonies and 3-strike laws and things of that nature. So like all of those things like led up in the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, right? So there were things there were these signs that were popping up that were warning us, but we were comfortable with some of these things as the news came in, right? We were comfortable with these things because it didn't necessarily touch us. And every time something comes up that is a problem for others that we find our comfort in, we can still be comfortable in that. That's what I want us to really try to explore. Like, how am I seeing this, right? Whether it's a knee on a neck or a mailbox being pulled off the ground, how am I seeing this and being comfortable, right? That I think is what really is this stagnation, is this lack of wokeness that we really need to pay attention to, because, and everybody has said this throughout history, an infringement upon the rights of one is an infringement upon the rights of all. And I think we need to get a lot more connected with the all as opposed to the I, to help us to better understand how our comfort is leading to the dilapidation, the falling apart of all these institutional structures of humanity, not of the country, of humanity, that we need to keep us moving in the right direction. So just examine what you're comfortable with, and then think about why you're comfortable with those things.
Thank you. Sean.
I agree with everything that's been said already, but if I could add something else, I'd probably say words. Words are often the starting point of anything that's good or bad. I mean, we often don't consider our words to be actions, and that can be dangerous. If we underestimate the impact of our words, then that can make us underestimate the wrongs of what we're doing. I think that one thing I read which was the other day, was a quote, and I'm just going to kind of paraphrase it. There's a saying that says that whoever witnesses something evil, let him or her change it with his hand, and if he or she is unable, then with his tongue, and if they're unable to do that, then with his or her heart. But that's the weakest form of faith. So I guess how I interpreted that is that we can't remain to be a bystander to any form of injustice. We should be morally obligated to do everything in one's power to eradicate certain systemic injustices. Activism could encompass both collective and individual efforts. We should be called upon as human beings to work individually and collectively to eradicate injustice on the micro and macro levels through our own actions. And I think that is what it all starts with, is with us.
Okay, thank you. Jackie.
Okay, well, I have a few things that, I think, first of all, I agree you have to think about what works for you, and this may not work for everyone, so I'll just share some of the things that work for me. I think small, not big. So I work within the sphere of what I can control and have the power to change. So don't start with taking down the building. Maybe you start with taking down a brick. Second, I am bold. I risk aversion, I think, stifles creativity. And I think we're at living times where we need to take risks and to be able to foster creativity and dismantle white supremacism. Second, I nurture relationships a lot of people who support my work, because when the system strikes back at me individually because I am trying to take it down or make a change or transform it, and trust me, it will come back at you. I want to have some people that can support me and remind me that not to give up, to keep on going. And finally, I always try to aim to not detract myself from what got us to inhabit these spaces of violence in the first place. And they are violent spaces. So always making a distinction between the individual level of enhancing our skills, like active listening and what others have mentioned. But I chose the photo more for structural injustices, which are more the policies and behaviors that are embedded within our institutions. And structural injustices are not about lack of diversity or miscommunication or sense of unbelongingness or lack of understanding. It is about those policies and behaviors that have been normalized. And so therefore, for those structural injustices, more diversity training or more communication or more diverse curriculum is not enough. It's important, I don't want to diminish it, but it is not enough, and by itself, it will not change the structures of oppression. And we've all seen the comments of, well, it's just such and such being who he is. He just doesn't have the skill set. He just doesn't know enough. And that is not what structural injustice is about. I think that if we want to eliminate structural injustices, we need to replace the existing policies and behaviors that perpetuate that violence while enhancing those individual skills. So I'm always worried when I see more photos of diverse people and minoritized folks on institutional websites, and more increase on training and conversation, and many communication about, well, if someone makes a racist comment or is on the receiving end of the racist comment, we will just use failed legalistic processes like Title IX, and we'll give them due process. And those processes do not help us share our common humanity. So I'll say that those are some of the things that I think we should be aware of. And in the meantime, I hope to see you at the street hacking away at some wall.
Thanks, Jackie. I'm going to go next. So Beverly Daniel Tatum is a psychologist. She's the former president of Spelman College, and she's the author of a book called Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And Tatum writes about systemic racism, systemic justice as a kind of moving walkway. And, because it's systemic, if you stand still on the moving walkway, you just get carried along. And to work for justice, you really have to turn around and go the other direction. And that means that you go upstream, you are going against the current. And Tatum also talks about walking upstream, going against the current by doing what we can in our own spheres of influence. And I am a huge believer in spheres of influence. And I think about my own spheres of influence. That's who I am and what I do. I'm a faculty member, I'm a facilitator and civic organizer, I'm a parent, I'm a community member. So as a parent, I can have conversations with my own kids about justice and injustice, about racism and misogyny, and what our role is, what their role should be. As a community member, I can put my time into organizations and initiatives that are working for racial and economic and other kinds of justice. And as a facilitator and organizer, I work with people who want to engage with these issues and having the kinds of conversations that Yvonne is talking about that are real, authentic conversations to shift power differences. And as a faculty member, I bring issues of systemic racism, economic injustice, misogyny into the classes that I teach. They're there anyway. I just spotlight them and bring them to attention. And this is kind of the making the invisible visible. It's an integral part of the NCR program and the 2040 initiative. And in the research and writing that I do, I bring the legal training that I have to bear on the project of really kind of trying to dissect how structural injustice works, because as Jackie says, it is about policies, it is about institutions, and lawyers constructed and often continue to construct these institutions. And all too often lawyers hide their tracks, right? So they pretend they're not doing it. So anyway, everyone has a sphere of influence. And I think the question is, what are my spheres and how can I sort of work against that moving walkway to work for justice? And I think if enough of us turn around and are going the other direction on the moving walkway, then sooner or later people will realize that we're all trying to get to a different destination than the one where the moving walkway was taking us. So, Chris, over to you.
All right. Oh, did I hit the right thing? All right.
Yep, we can hear you.
All right. I was having stuff popping up on my screen. Anyway, I would definitely agree with what a lot of colleagues talked about with the spheres of influence, and just another take on that. I would think, as we think through everything that's kind of been washing over us today, and we take some time to reflect and come to some discernment later on down the line, think about not only the spaces in which we influence, but also the ways in which we are influenced. And what spaces are we putting ourselves into? What spaces do we have to really gird ourselves to not be influenced in the wrong way? So really think about where we're getting our information, who we're interacting with, how we're going to interact back, because that's really important in doing this work of justice. We also need to really just, this whole idea when somebody comes to us and talks about being colorblind, shut that down. We really don't need people. I don't want anybody who doesn't see me for my full self. I want to be able to be my full and authentic self in any situation. And I don't want conditional inclusion. So when we talk about inclusion, I mean, that's a big part of my job, and something that I say over and over again. It's not just a matter of getting people who are different, having diversity and having a bunch of people who are different who come and have to present a false version of themselves to be included. We have to aim however long it takes and however much work it takes to create spaces, both in our society and our institutions, where people feel that they can be their full selves, their authentic selves, and not just survive, but actually thrive. And when we talk about a collective, be it our society, be it our institutions, if we're going to say that all these members are, all these folks are part of it, that, oh, you know, you're an American, you're an American, you're an American, regardless of your gender, your sexuality, your race, well, then you need to have full ownership in this collective, not conditional ownership. So I would just finish off by saying that we need to make sure that we're really respecting the humanity in each other, and we're doing it for humanity's sake, not due to the connections that it has to us. When you see people come on television and they say, man, this racism's really bad. I'm white and I adopted a Black kid and now I know. Well, how about you don't want anybody to be mistreated because they're a fellow human, that you want people to have that equal access. And lastly, I would say that when we're looking at marginalization, when we're looking at oppression, that we just don't look at the conditions and the circumstances of the marginalized or the oppressed, that we dig a little deeper and we really try to pull back the curtain on who's benefiting from the oppression of others, who's benefiting from the marginalization of others, because if no one benefited, it wouldn't be passed from generation to generation. It would just die. Because who's going to put all that effort into perpetuating systems and structures and institutions that result in marginalizing or oppressing others if nobody benefits? People don't work for free. So
Thank
those
you.
are the things I would think of.
No, that was great. Thank you all. And I'm going to pass it back to Jackie to wrap up.
Thank you. I'm going to wrap up and then send it back to Abby. But before that, putting these events together are always a collaborative effort, which I enjoy very much personally and selfishly, but I know the NCR program and the team we have do as well. So I want to start by being grateful to Abby Young, the Director of Education Services at the Durham Museum, and which you have seen walking around showing our photos, and her team, who enthusiastically said yes when we approached them to collaborate on this event. And then when it couldn't be done face-to-face, she reached out and said, what about doing it online? So thank you so much, Abby, to you and your team. I also want to to thank all this distinguished panelists here. It's been a wonderful conversation. So thank you so much for taking time to come in and share your thoughts and experiences on such an important and relevant topic and timely. I also want to thank Dr. Gail Jensen and Dr. Cindy Constanzo. Dr. Gail Jensen is the Dean of the Graduate School, and Dr. Constanzo is the chair of our department in interdisciplinary studies, because they are always extremely supportive. And I know Cindy, I'm not sure if she's still there, but she always makes a point to try to come to our events. So I'm thankful for their support. We couldn't do this without their support. We also have some amazing, extraordinary colleagues at Creighton University, far too many to name, but they are always standing by in solidarity with us and supporting our projects and our events and our ideas, which sometimes start by sounding really crazy, but somehow we make them happen. And that includes the staff. For this particular event, I do want to give a shout out to Monica Chapeau at the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies. Thank you so much, you were a lifesaver. And last but not least, all the attendees and everyone who took this hour of their time to come and hear us. The negotiation and conflict resolution program is grounded in Ignatian values. We are a Jesuit institution, and we firmly believe that each person has a responsibility and a right to contribute to the good of the whole society. And so thanks you to all to helping us advance social justice in this way. And finally, I do want to invite you, if you're interested in these topics, to join us in our Facebook page at Creighton University Negotiation and Conflict Resolution Program, and follow us on Twitter at Creighton NCR. We put there out the work we do, some interesting courses on social organizing that we're putting together in spring. So we share all of our events there. So please follow us, and thank you very much. And now I'm going to back to you, Abby.
Thank you. So obviously from us here at the museum, thank you to all the panelists, to Jackie and Palma. I know we were all bummed that we had to cancel the spring event, but I'm really grateful we could still do this, and definitely to all of our panelists who agreed to do it virtually. I just actually wanted to wrap up. We're standing technically outside the exhibit now. This is an addition that we made to the Newseum's exhibit, talking a little bit about Pulitzer Prizes that have been won by publications here in Omaha. The exhibit is here until September 20th. We were really lucky that we were able to extend it. The museum is open. We ask that you register to attend ahead of time online, and you can do that at durhammuseum.org. Right now we're open Tuesday through Sunday. We are closed on Mondays. And again, it's here till September 20th. It is a can't miss exhibit, and I hope that some of you will come down and hopefully take thoughts from today's conversation or things that you heard other people say, and perhaps be able to apply it to other photos in the exhibit. I know the panelists had a hard time just picking one to talk about. So we hope to see you soon. Thank you again. We have lots of other virtual opportunities coming up. So we hope to see you online again soon too. And we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Thanks, everybody.